The $200 meal on your fancy restaurant plate? It was once considered literal garbage. Imagine being served a dish that costs more than your monthly phone bill, presented with white gloves as other diners look on with envy. 150 years ago, it started prison riots. That's exactly what happened with lobster. Once so plentiful along the American coastline that it was literally ground up and used as fertilizer. Servants and prisoners were fed so much lobster that Massachusetts actually passed a law limiting how often it could be served to inmates because it was considered cruel punishment. And the most shocking example at number 8? A food so disgusting that wealthy people would literally vomit at the sight of it. Now they pay $2,000 for a single serving. I couldn't believe what I discovered about these foods. It changed the way I look at restaurant menus forever. Let's start with the poster child of food status reversals, the lobster. These days, a single lobster dinner at a high-end restaurant can easily set you back $100 or more. But in colonial America, these sea bugs were so abundant that they would wash up on shores in piles 2 feet high. Native Americans used them as fertilizer for crops and bait for fishing. When European colonizers arrived, they were actually embarrassed to eat lobster. It was fed to prisoners, enslaved people, and indentured servants so frequently that many contracts specifically limited how often lobster could be served. The turning point? Railroads. When trains began connecting the coasts in the 1850s, inland Americans who had never seen the ocean started ordering this exotic seafood without knowing its reputation. By the 1880s, the prices had skyrocketed and the transformation was complete. If you've ever been to a fancy raw bar, you know that a dozen oysters can easily cost $40 or more. But in 19th century New York City, oysters were so plentiful that they were literally street food. The waters around Manhattan once contained half of the world's oyster population. They were so cheap that even the poorest New Yorkers could afford them. Oyster carts were as common as hot dog stands are today. What changed? Pollution and overharvesting. By the early 1900s, New York's oyster beds were so contaminated that they had to be closed. Suddenly, what had been an everyday food became a rare luxury. That creamy cornmeal dish topped with exotic mushrooms and truffle oil that cost $30 at your local bistro. For centuries, it was considered the most basic peasant food in northern Italy. Polenta was the staple food of poor Italian farmers who couldn't afford wheat flour. Made from cornmeal, boiled into a thick porridge, it was filling, cheap, and, well, that's about it. It was so associated with poverty that wealthy Italians wouldn't touch it. Today, chefs at high-end restaurants serve artisanal polenta with fancy toppings and charge prices that would make an Italian grandmother faint. The next time you see bone marrow on a menu for $25, remember that this was the food people ate when they couldn't afford meat and could barely buy anything else. Throughout history, the wealthy would take the prime cuts of meat, leaving the bones and organs for the poor. The working class, not wanting to waste anything, would crack open the bones and scoop out the fatty tissue inside, the marrow. In medieval Europe, marrow was such a poor people's food that it was called beggar's butter. Today, you'll find it on toast topped with capers and sea salt at restaurants with weeks-long waits. That $200 omakase experience where a chef personally prepares each piece of raw fish for you, it began as a way to preserve fish when refrigeration didn't exist. Original sushi wasn't the fresh, raw delicacy we know today. It was fermented fish packed in rice and left to sit for months. And you didn't even eat the rice. It was only there as a preservative. Even when it evolved into something closer to what we know as sushi today, in the 19th century, it was still street food, a Japanese hot dog cart equivalent. Sushi chefs set up stands on the street to serve quick, cheap bites to laborers for lunch. It wasn't until sushi arrived in America in the 1960s that it transformed into a high-end cuisine. That $45 oxtail stew? For centuries, it was literally given away because butchers couldn't sell it. Oxtail was considered a waste product, trash. Butchers gave it to poor customers for free or sold it for pennies just to get rid of it. In the American South, Caribbean, and parts of Africa, enslaved people and their descendants turned these unwanted cuts into delicious, slow-cooked stews out of necessity. Today, those same recipes are being served in high-end restaurants at premium prices. Now, oxtail is often more expensive per pound than steak. For hundreds of years, caviar has been an expensive delicacy, but it hasn't always been that way. In 19th century Russia, it was so common that it was served free in bars, like peanuts or pretzels today. The salty fish eggs would make patrons thirstier, encouraging them to order more vodka. As they drank more, they ate more. Bad for society, but great for business. Fishermen along the Volga River considered sturgeon eggs a nuisance byproduct. In America, it was once so abundant that it was served in saloons for free, but by the 1870s, it became the world's largest exporter of caviar. Overfishing and pollution changed everything. By the early 20th century, sturgeon populations had collapsed, and what had once been bar food became one of the most expensive delicacies on Earth. Here's our most shocking at number 8. Foie gras. This fatty duck or goose liver can cost upwards of $2,000 per kilogram. This luxury food was invented by peasants trying to get the most out of their livestock. The practice of force-feeding geese to enlarge their livers dates back to ancient Egypt, but it was perfected by Jewish farmers in medieval France. Unable to afford much land, these communities maximized what they could get from each animal. For centuries, foie gras remained a lowly peasant food in rural France, something farmers ate while selling the better cuts to the wealthy. It wasn't until the French Revolution disrupted the aristocracy that chefs began opening restaurants for the public, bringing these peasant preparations with them and elevating them to haute cuisine. That $18 artisanal ramen bowl with the perfectly cooked egg and heritage pork, it began as one of the cheapest meals possible in post-war Japan. Ramen was introduced to Japan by Chinese immigrants and quickly became popular among the working class because it was filling and inexpensive. Street vendors would sell bowls for a few yen each, making it accessible to laborers, students, and anyone else on a tight budget. In America, instant ramen became the ultimate symbol of broke college students and anyone else trying to stretch their food budget to the absolute limit. In the early 2000s, the transformation began. Chefs started creating craft ramen using high-quality ingredients and traditional techniques. Suddenly, what had been a meal of last resort became a culinary experience worth waiting in line for. Our final food might be the most recent transformation. That $8 per pound superfood grain at Whole Foods was once so frowned upon in South America that people would hide it when guests came over. For thousands of years, quinoa was a staple food of indigenous people in the Andes. When Spanish colonizers arrived, they dismissed quinoa as Indian food and forced many indigenous people to grow wheat instead. That all changed in the early 2000s when quinoa was marketed to Western consumers as a superfood. Suddenly, demand skyrocketed, and so did the prices. So much that many of the people who had traditionally grown and eaten quinoa could no longer afford it themselves. So, what does all this tell us? Food status is subjective and incredibly fluid. The lobster's journey from prison food to luxury item shows us that our perception of what's disgusting versus delicious has more to do with culture and scarcity than actual taste. Next time you're at a fancy restaurant paying big money for any of these, remember, you might be eating what was once considered garbage. And who knows, maybe in 100 years, people will pay hundreds of dollars for something we throw away today. What do you think? Is there a disgusting food from today that will become tomorrow's delicacy? Let us know in the comments below. Speaking of things that don't work the way they should, have you ever wondered why McDonald's ice cream machines are always broken? It's not just bad luck. There's actually a fascinating conspiracy behind it that affects McDonald's across the country. We will reveal the shocking truth about why you can never get that McFlurry you're craving, and how a secret agreement costs owners millions. Click the video on screen now to discover the cold, hard truth about McDonald's ice cream machines. I'm not saying Illuminati, but I'm not saying it either.